The bell above the door of Fitzwilliam's barbershop jingled, announcing the arrival of a new customer. Mr. Johnson, a man of impeccable style in a tailored charcoal suit, stepped inside. The air hung heavy with the scent of bay rum and hair tonic, a familiar aroma that usually brought a sense of calm. Today, however, it only served to heighten the tension that coiled in his gut. Fitzwilliam, the owner, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with a scowl, looked up from the newspaper he was reading. His eyes, magnified by thick spectacles, lingered on Mr. Johnson for a moment longer than necessary. Mr. Johnson, a successful businessman accustomed to being treated with respect, felt the weight of that gaze, a silent assessment that felt deeply uncomfortable. Mr. Johnson approached the barber chair, his movements deliberate and self-assured. He cleared his throat, a subtle gesture meant to break the uncomfortable silence. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice calm and measured. "I'd like a haircut, please." Fitzwilliam lowered his newspaper, the rustle a sound that seemed to amplify the silence in the small shop. He studied Mr. Johnson again, his gaze lingering on his polished shoes, his crisp shirt, his neatly trimmed beard. The scrutiny felt invasive, almost hostile. "I'm afraid I can't accommodate you," Fitzwilliam said, his voice flat and devoid of any warmth. The words hung in the air, sharp and unexpected. Mr. Johnson felt a prickle of disbelief. He'd never encountered such blatant refusal before. "I beg your pardon?" Mr. Johnson asked, his voice maintaining its even tone, though a flicker of surprise betrayed his composure. He couldn't quite believe what he'd just heard. Was this a joke? A misunderstanding? Fitzwilliam leaned back in his chair, a smug expression settling on his face. "My shop isn't for people like you," he stated, his words dripping with thinly veiled racism. The statement was so blunt, so unapologetic, that it left Mr. Johnson momentarily speechless. The blood rushed to Mr. Johnson's face, a surge of anger threatening to boil over. He'd encountered subtle forms of racism before, the microaggressions that chipped away at one's dignity. But this was different. This was a blatant, unapologetic rejection based solely on the color of his skin. He took a deep breath, consciously slowing his breathing to regain control. He knew that reacting with anger would only play into Fitzwilliam's hands. He needed to be strategic, to choose his response carefully. This wasn't just about a haircut. It was about something much larger. He considered his options. He could make a scene, call him out publicly for his racism, but that felt too impulsive, too reactive. He wanted something more lasting, something that would truly address the root of the problem. He had a plan forming in his mind, a plan that would utilize his position of power to address the injustice he'd just experienced. "I understand," Mr. Johnson said, his voice surprisingly calm. The calmness was a mask, carefully constructed to hide the simmering fury beneath. "Thank you for your honesty." The emphasis on the word honesty was deliberate, laced with a hint of sarcasm that Fitzwilliam seemed too obtuse to notice. He turned and walked towards the door, the jingling bell a mocking soundtrack to his retreat. He felt a burning humiliation, a sense of injustice that settled deep in his bones. But as he stepped out onto the street, the anger began to morph into something colder, something more focused. This wasn't over. Far from it. He had a plan, and he intended to see it through to the very end. The humiliation would fuel his resolve. The injustice would be his motivation. Fitzwilliam had made a mistake, a monumental mistake, and Mr. Johnson intended to make sure he paid the price. He pulled out his phone, his fingers already dialing a number, a small smile playing on his lips. The game had begun. The crisp autumn air did little to soothe the simmering anger that burned within Mr. Johnson as he walked away from Fitzwilliam's barbershop. The humiliation of being so openly rejected, so casually dismissed because of his skin color, stung more than he cared to admit. He felt a familiar tightness in his chest, a physical manifestation of the injustice he had just witnessed. He'd faced racism before, of course, but this was different. This was blatant, unapologetic, and deeply personal. He hadn't reacted. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't created a scene. He'd chosen a different path, a path of calculated response, of quiet power. As he walked, he replayed the encounter in his mind, analyzing Fitzwilliam's words, his demeanor, the subtle nuances of his prejudice. He was gathering evidence, not just for himself, but for the larger battle he intended to wage. He reached his car, a sleek, black sedan, and slid into the driver's seat. The leather was cool against his skin, a small comfort in the face of the simmering rage. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm within. He needed to think clearly, to plan his next move carefully. Impulsivity wouldn't serve him. Precision and strategy would. He pulled out his phone, the cool glass a stark contrast to the heat of his emotions. He dialed a number, the digits familiar and comforting. It was his lawyer, Ms. Anya Sharma, a sharp, intelligent woman who had fought countless battles against discrimination. He explained the situation, his voice calm and measured despite the turmoil within. He laid out the facts, the details, the blatant racism he had encountered. Ms. Sharma listened patiently, her silence punctuated only by the occasional murmur of agreement. When he finished, she spoke, her voice calm and reassuring. "Mr. Johnson," she said, "this is unacceptable. We have a strong case, but we need to proceed strategically." They discussed the options, weighing the pros and cons of various legal actions. A lawsuit was a possibility, of course, but Ms. Sharma suggested a different approach, one that would be more immediate, more impactful. She suggested using his position as the landlord of the building to address the situation directly. Mr. Johnson considered this. He owned the building where Fitzwilliam's barbershop was located. It was a fact he hadn't initially considered in the heat of the moment, but now it presented a powerful opportunity. He could use his legal leverage to force Fitzwilliam to confront his prejudice, to face the consequences of his actions. He hung up the phone, a sense of purpose replacing the simmering anger. He had a plan. He wouldn't just file a lawsuit. He would use his position to confront the issue head-on, to force Fitzwilliam to account for his actions. He would make an example of him, not just for himself, but for every other black man who had faced similar discrimination. The humiliation wouldn't be in vain. It would fuel his actions, sharpen his focus, and ultimately lead to justice. He felt a surge of resolve, a quiet determination that settled deep within him. The game was on, and he was ready to play. The following morning, Mr. Johnson woke with a renewed sense of purpose. The anger from yesterday had subsided, replaced by a cool, calculating resolve. He wasn't consumed by rage. Instead, he felt a quiet intensity, a focused energy that fueled his plan. He knew exactly what he needed to do. His strategy wasn't about impulsive retaliation. It was about strategic action, about using his position of power to address the injustice he'd faced. He spent the morning reviewing Fitzwilliam's lease agreement, meticulously examining every clause, every condition. He wanted to ensure he had a legally sound basis for his actions. He wasn't looking for loopholes. He was looking for justification, for a clear and undeniable reason to terminate the lease. While he had a strong moral case, he needed a legally sound one to back it up. He found it in a clause concerning the maintenance of a respectful and inclusive environment within the business. It was a standard clause, common in most commercial leases, designed to protect the interests of both the landlord and the tenant. However, in light of Fitzwilliam's blatant racism, this clause became a powerful weapon. He also spent time gathering additional evidence. He scoured online reviews of Fitzwilliam's barbershop, looking for any patterns of discriminatory behavior. He found several reviews, some veiled, some explicit, that mentioned Fitzwilliam's prejudice against black customers. These reviews, while not legally binding on their own, would serve as powerful supporting evidence for his case. He even reached out to a few people he knew in the community, individuals who had frequented the barbershop in the past. He discreetly inquired about their experiences, focusing on whether they had encountered any instances of discrimination. He received several hush confirmations, accounts that echoed his own experience, confirming the pattern of behavior. He carefully documented these accounts, ensuring he had verifiable information to support his claims. By midday, he had compiled a comprehensive dossier, a collection of evidence that solidified his case. He had the lease agreement, the online reviews, and the testimonies of several individuals. This wasn't just about his personal experience. It was about a pattern of discriminatory behavior that needed to be addressed. He was building a case, not just for himself, but for everyone who had faced similar prejudice. He felt a sense of satisfaction, a quiet confidence that settled over him. He wasn't just reacting to Fitzwilliam's racism. He was proactively addressing it, using his position to create change. He wasn't simply seeking revenge. He was seeking justice. He was using his power to create a ripple effect, to send a message that discrimination would not be tolerated. He was ready. He would visit Fitzwilliam's barbershop, not as a customer, but as the landlord, armed with the evidence he had meticulously gathered. The confrontation was imminent. The game was about to reach its next stage. The bell above the door of Fitzwilliam's barbershop jingled, a familiar sound that usually signaled the arrival of a customer. This time, however, the sound held a different weight, a different significance. Mr. Johnson stepped inside, not as a potential client seeking a haircut, but as the building's owner, armed with a meticulously compiled dossier and a steely resolve. Fitzwilliam, still nursing the lingering resentment from the previous day's encounter, looked up from his newspaper, his eyes narrowing as he recognized Mr. Johnson. A flicker of unease crossed his face, a subtle shift in his demeanor that betrayed his inner turmoil. He'd expected Mr. Johnson to simply disappear, to let the incident fade into the background. He hadn't anticipated this. Mr. Johnson walked directly to the counter, his movements deliberate and self-assured. He placed a briefcase on the counter, the leather a stark contrast to the worn wood. He opened the briefcase, revealing a neatly organized collection of documents, the lease agreement, printouts of online reviews, and handwritten statements from former customers. "Mr. Fitzwilliam," Mr. Johnson began, his voice calm and measured, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing beneath the surface. "I believe we need to have a conversation." Fitzwilliam's face paled. He stammered, trying to find words, to offer an excuse, but the words caught in his throat. He knew, instinctively, that this was not a casual conversation. This was a reckoning. Mr. Johnson continued, his voice unwavering. "Yesterday, you refused to provide service to me based on my race. I have here irrefutable evidence that this was not an isolated incident, but rather a pattern of discriminatory behavior." He gestured towards the documents in the briefcase, each one a piece of evidence in his carefully constructed case. Fitzwilliam tried to speak, to interrupt, but Mr. Johnson held up a hand, silencing him. "Let me finish," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "I have reviewed your lease agreement. Clause 7.2 clearly states that you are obligated to maintain a respectful and inclusive environment within your business. Your actions have violated this clause repeatedly." He pointed to the online reviews, each one a testament to Fitzwilliam's prejudice. He then presented the handwritten statements, each one a first-hand account of discrimination. Fitzwilliam's face was a mask of shock and disbelief, his earlier bravado replaced by a growing sense of fear. I didn't mean for it to be like that," Fitzwilliam stammered, his voice barely a whisper. He tried to offer an explanation, a justification, but his words lacked conviction, his excuses hollow. He knew he was caught. His prejudice had been exposed, laid bare for all to see. Mr. Johnson remained impassive, his expression unchanging. He listened to Fitzwilliam's feeble attempts at justification, allowing him to exhaust his excuses before delivering the final blow. "Mr. Fitzwilliam," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, "your lease is terminated. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Fitzwilliam's face crumpled, his bravado completely gone, replaced by a look of utter defeat. The consequences of his actions had finally caught up with him. The weight of his prejudice, his blatant disregard for human dignity, had resulted in the loss of his livelihood. The bell above the door jingled again, but this time it signaled not the arrival of a customer, but the end of an era. The air in Fitzwilliam's barbershop hung heavy with the silence following Mr. Johnson's pronouncement. The once familiar scent of bay rum and hair tonic now felt suffocating, a stark reminder of the business that was about to be lost. Fitzwilliam stared at the eviction notice, the crisp white paper a stark contrast to the defeated slump of his shoulders. He'd spent years building this business, pouring his heart and soul into creating a space he considered his own. Now it was all slipping away. He looked up at Mr. Johnson, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger, regret, and disbelief. He'd expected a fight, a confrontation, perhaps even a negotiation. He hadn't expected this quiet, decisive action. Mr. Johnson hadn't raised his voice, hadn't resorted to insults or threats. He'd simply stated the facts, presented the evidence, and delivered the verdict. The efficiency of it all was both unsettling and humiliating. Fitzwilliam tried to speak, to plead his case, to offer some kind of explanation or justification. But the words wouldn't come. He was speechless, his usual bluster and arrogance replaced by a stunned silence. He knew, deep down, that he deserved this. His prejudice, his blatant disregard for the dignity of others, had finally caught up with him. He looked around the barber shop, his gaze lingering on the worn barber chairs, the faded posters on the wall, the familiar tools of his trade. Each object held a memory, a piece of his life's work. And now it was all coming to an end. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, crushing him under the burden of his own mistakes. He tried to salvage some dignity, to salvage some semblance of control. "This isn't fair," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. I didn't mean to cause any harm." The words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. They were excuses, weak and unconvincing, offered by a man who had finally been confronted with the consequences of his actions. Mr. Johnson remained impassive, his expression unchanging. He'd seen the regret in Fitzwilliam's eyes, heard the desperation in his voice. But he felt no sympathy. This wasn't about personal feelings. It was about justice, about accountability. Fitzwilliam's actions had consequences, and he needed to face them. Mr. Johnson picked up his briefcase, the leather cool against his fingers. He didn't offer any words of comfort, no empty platitudes. He simply turned and walked towards the door, the jingling bell a stark reminder of the business that was about to be lost. He left Fitzwilliam alone with his regrets, alone with the consequences of his actions. The silence that followed was deafening, a testament to the finality of Mr. Johnson's decision. The game was far from over, but this chapter had reached its conclusion. The consequences of prejudice were clear, and Fitzwilliam was about to learn a harsh lesson. Fitzwilliam stared at the eviction notice, the crisp white paper a stark reminder of his impending downfall. The barber shop, his life's work, was about to be taken from him. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, a crushing burden of regret and self-loathing. He'd spent years building this business, pouring his heart and soul into creating a space he considered his own, a sanctuary where he could practice his craft and connect with his community. Now, it was all slipping away, a victim of his own prejudice. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the gesture a nervous tic, a physical manifestation of his inner turmoil. He looked around the barber shop, his gaze lingering on the familiar objects that had surrounded him for so long. The worn barber chairs, the faded posters on the wall, the gleaming tools of his trade. Each object held a memory, a piece of his life's work. And now it was all coming to an end. He thought about Mr. Johnson, the man he had so casually dismissed, the man who had ultimately wielded the power to destroy his business. He'd underestimated Mr. Johnson, dismissed him as just another customer, another face in the crowd. He hadn't considered the possibility that this customer held the power to change his life. He'd been blinded by his own prejudice, his own arrogance. The anger that had initially fueled his refusal to serve Mr. Johnson now felt insignificant, a pale shadow of the overwhelming regret that consumed him. He'd had opportunities to change, to challenge his own biases, but he'd chosen to cling to his prejudices, to allow his ingrained beliefs to dictate his actions. And now he was paying the price. He considered appealing the eviction notice, fighting for his business, but he knew it was a futile effort. Mr. Johnson had presented a strong case, a meticulously constructed argument that left no room for doubt. He'd gathered evidence, documented instances of discrimination, and presented a legally sound case for termination. There was no way to fight it. He slumped into his barber chair, the worn leather offering little comfort. He closed his eyes, allowing the memories to flood back. The laughter of his customers, the camaraderie of his fellow barbers, the satisfaction of a perfectly executed haircut. These were the things he would lose, the things he had taken for granted. He thought about his future, the uncertainty that lay ahead. He had no savings, no backup plan. He'd poured all his resources into the barbershop, neglecting other avenues of income. Now, he faced financial ruin, social ostracization, and the crushing weight of his own mistakes. He opened his eyes, staring at the eviction notice again. The words were stark, unforgiving, but they were also a wake-up call, a harsh lesson in the consequences of prejudice. He had a lot of thinking to do, a lot of soul-searching to undertake. The loss of his barbershop was devastating, but perhaps it was also an opportunity for growth, for change, for a chance to confront the prejudices that had defined him for so long. The road ahead was uncertain, but he knew one thing. He had to change. He had to be better. The 24-hour deadline loomed, a stark reminder of the impending loss of his barbershop. Fitzwilliam moved through the familiar space, a ghost in his own establishment, each object a painful reminder of what he was about to lose. He'd spent years building this place, pouring his heart and soul into every detail. Now, it was all coming to an end, not with a bang, but with a quiet, unceremonious eviction. He began packing, his movements slow and deliberate, each item handled with a reverence that bordered on mourning. He carefully wrapped his barber tools, each one a testament to his skill and dedication. He folded his aprons, the worn fabric a testament to years of service. He packed away his photographs, his personal mementos, each one a reminder of happier times. The process was agonizing, each item a painful reminder of what he was losing. He felt a profound sense of loss, not just for the business itself, but for the community he'd built around it. He'd known his customers for years, some for decades, and the thought of severing those connections was almost unbearable. He paused, staring at a framed photograph of himself with his grandfather, a man who had taught him the barbering trade. He remembered his grandfather's lessons, not just about the craft, but about the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of their background. He'd forgotten those lessons, allowing his prejudices to cloud his judgment. He moved on to the more mundane tasks, emptying the drawers, discarding old magazines and newspapers. He noticed a stack of letters, mostly complaints, tucked away in a corner. He hadn't looked at them in months, preferring to ignore the negativity. Now, he felt compelled to read them, to confront the truth of his actions. As he read, a wave of shame washed over him. He dismissed many of these complaints, attributing them to disgruntled customers or simply ignoring the underlying racism. Now, he saw them for what they were, evidence of his own prejudice, his own failure to treat everyone with fairness and respect. He'd been blind to his own shortcomings, blinded by his ingrained biases. He continued packing, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He felt a profound sense of regret, a deep remorse for the harm he'd caused. He'd not only lost his business, but he'd lost the respect of his community, the trust of his customers. He'd damaged his reputation, perhaps irrevocably. As he finished packing, he looked around the empty space, the silence amplifying the weight of his loss. He felt a profound sense of emptiness, a void that went beyond the loss of his business. He'd lost something far more valuable, his integrity, his self-respect. The eviction wasn't just the end of his business. It was the beginning of a long and difficult journey of self-reflection and change. He had a lot of work to do, a lot of amends to make. The road to redemption would be long and arduous, but he knew he had to start somewhere. He had to begin the process of rebuilding, not just his business, but himself. The following morning, Fitzwilliam stood on the sidewalk, watching as movers carried the last of his belongings out of the barbershop. The familiar sign, once a symbol of his pride and accomplishment, now looked forlorn and out of place, a relic of a bygone era. He felt a pang of grief, a sharp stab of loss that went beyond the material possessions. He was losing more than just a business. He was losing a part of himself. He watched as the movers loaded his equipment into a truck, each item a reminder of his skill, his dedication, his years of hard work. He'd poured his heart and soul into this business, building it from the ground up, nurturing it through thick and thin. And now, it was all gone, a casualty of his own prejudice. He felt a wave of shame wash over him, a deep sense of regret for his actions. He'd allowed his biases to dictate his behavior, his ingrained prejudices to cloud his judgment. He'd treated Mr. Johnson with disrespect, dismissed him based solely on the color of his skin. And in doing so, he'd not only harmed Mr. Johnson but also damaged his own reputation. He thought about the community he'd served, the customers he'd known for years. He'd built relationships with many of them, forged bonds based on trust and mutual respect. Now, those relationships were shattered, irrevocably damaged by his actions. He'd lost the trust of his community, the support of his customers. He'd alienated those he'd once considered friends. He had no one to blame but himself. He'd made his choices, and now he was facing the consequences. There was no one to appeal to, no one to blame. He had to take responsibility for his actions, accept the consequences, and begin the difficult process of rebuilding his life. He watched as the movers locked the door to the barber shop, the sound of the lock clicking shut echoing the finality of his loss. He turned and walked away, leaving behind the business he'd spent years building, the community he'd once served, and the life he'd once known. He felt a profound sense of emptiness, a void that went beyond the material possessions. He'd lost something far more valuable, his integrity, his self-respect. He walked aimlessly, lost in thought, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with challenges and uncertainties. He had no savings, no backup plan, no clear path forward. But he also knew that he had to move on, to rebuild his life, to make amends for his past mistakes. He had to learn from his experiences, confront his prejudices, and become a better person. The eviction wasn't just the end of his business. It was the beginning of a long and difficult journey of self-reflection and change. The news of Fitzwilliam's eviction spread quickly through the community. It wasn't just a local story. It became a talking point, a subject of heated debate in coffee shops, barber shops, and online forums. Some expressed sympathy for Fitzwilliam, acknowledging his loss but not condoning his actions. Others celebrated Mr. Johnson's decisive action, seeing it as a victory against systemic racism. The story gained traction on social media, with various perspectives and opinions shared across different platforms. Some praised Mr. Johnson's handling of the situation, highlighting his strategic use of his position as landlord to address the issue of discrimination. Others criticized Fitzwilliam's actions, pointing out the blatant racism that led to his downfall. The story sparked a wider conversation about racial prejudice, the power dynamics of landlord-tenant relationships, and the importance of accountability. Many people shared their own experiences with discrimination, creating a sense of solidarity and shared understanding. The incident served as a catalyst, bringing to light the pervasive nature of racism and the need for ongoing dialogue and change. Fitzwilliam's story became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the consequences of prejudice and discrimination. Meanwhile, Mr. Johnson, having achieved his immediate goal, began to reflect on the broader implications of the situation. He had successfully addressed the issue of discrimination at Fitzwilliam's barbershop, but he knew that this was just one instance of a much larger problem. He felt a sense of responsibility to use his influence to promote change, to advocate for a more just and equitable society. He considered his next steps, weighing the various options available to him. He could simply move on, focusing on his own business ventures. But he felt a deeper calling, a sense of purpose that went beyond personal gain. He realized that his actions had created a ripple effect, sparking a conversation that needed to continue. He decided to use his platform to advocate for change, to speak out against discrimination and promote inclusivity. He began by donating a significant sum of money to local organizations fighting for racial justice. He also reached out to community leaders, offering his support and expertise in addressing issues of inequality. He knew that his actions wouldn't solve all the problems, but he hoped they would inspire others to take a stand against discrimination, to challenge prejudice wherever they encountered it. He wanted to create a lasting impact, to make a difference in the lives of others. The eviction of Fitzwilliam's barbershop was just the beginning of a larger movement, a call for change that resonated far beyond the confines of a single barbershop. The story had evolved from a personal conflict into a community conversation, a catalyst for broader social change. The impact was far-reaching, and the implications were significant. Fitzwilliam found himself adrift, without a job, without a purpose, and without a clear path forward. The eviction from his barber shop had left a void in his life, a gaping hole where his identity and sense of self-worth once resided. He'd spent decades building his business, pouring his heart and soul into every detail, and now it was gone, a casualty of his own prejudice. The initial anger and resentment had subsided, replaced by a profound sense of regret and self-loathing. He'd had time to reflect on his actions, to confront the consequences of his choices. He'd spent sleepless nights replaying the events that led to his downfall, agonizing over his treatment of Mr. Johnson and the blatant racism that had defined his actions. He'd lost more than just his business. He'd lost the respect of his community, the trust of his customers, and most importantly, his own self-respect. He'd alienated those he'd once considered friends, damaged his reputation, and created a rift within his community. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, a crushing burden of guilt and shame. He tried to find work, but his reputation preceded him. Many potential employers, having heard about the incident, were hesitant to hire him. His prejudice had become a stain on his record, a mark that was difficult to erase. He felt isolated, alone, and increasingly desperate. He spent his days wandering the streets, lost in thought, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He'd lost his purpose, his sense of identity, his place in the community. He felt like a failure, a pariah, a man who had squandered his life's work through his own ignorance and bigotry. He began to understand the depth of the harm he'd caused, not just to Mr. Johnson, but to the wider community. He'd perpetuated a cycle of discrimination, reinforcing harmful stereotypes, and contributing to a climate of intolerance. He'd been a part of the problem, and now he had to find a way to become part of the solution. He started attending community meetings, listening to the experiences of others, and learning about the ongoing struggle for racial justice. He began to educate himself, reading books and articles about systemic racism, implicit bias, and the importance of diversity and inclusion. He started to confront his own prejudices, acknowledging the harm they had caused and committing to change. The road to redemption would be long and arduous, filled with challenges and setbacks. But he knew he had to start somewhere. He had to rebuild his life, not just his business, but his character. He had to make amends for his past mistakes and work towards becoming a better person, a more responsible member of his community. The eviction wasn't just the end of his business. It was the beginning of a long and difficult journey of self-reflection and change. Months passed. The empty storefront that had once housed Fitzwilliam's barbershop remained vacant, a stark reminder of the consequences of prejudice. The community continued to grapple with the aftermath of the incident, the conversations sparked by the eviction still echoing through local forums and social media. Mr. Johnson, having achieved his immediate goal, continued his efforts to promote social justice and racial equality. He used his platform to advocate for change, donating to relevant organizations and speaking out against discrimination. Fitzwilliam, meanwhile, had embarked on a journey of self-reflection and personal growth. He'd spent countless hours educating himself about systemic racism, implicit bias, and the importance of diversity and inclusion. He'd attended community meetings, listened to the experiences of others, and actively sought to understand the harm he'd caused. He'd also begun to make amends. He'd reached out to Mr. Johnson, offering a sincere and heartfelt apology. While Mr. Johnson didn't forgive him easily, he acknowledged Fitzwilliam's genuine remorse and willingness to change. The apology wasn't a simple act of contrition. It was the beginning of a long process of reconciliation. Fitzwilliam also reached out to other members of the community, acknowledging the harm he'd caused and seeking forgiveness. He volunteered at local organizations, working alongside those he had previously dismissed. He actively sought opportunities to engage in meaningful dialogue, to listen to diverse perspectives, and to learn from his mistakes. He began to rebuild his life, not as a barber, but as an advocate for social justice. He used his experiences to educate others, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prejudice and the importance of empathy and understanding. He became a vocal opponent of discrimination, using his platform to promote inclusivity and equality. He found work as a volunteer counselor, helping others navigate difficult situations and overcome personal challenges. He found a sense of purpose in his new role, using his experiences to help others. He discovered a different kind of satisfaction, a deeper sense of fulfillment than he'd ever found in his barbershop. He knew he couldn't erase his past mistakes, but he could learn from them. He could use his experiences to make a positive impact on the community he had once harmed. He understood that his journey of redemption would be a lifelong process, but he was committed to the task. He was determined to make amends, to become a better person, and to contribute to a more just and equitable society. The empty storefront remained a reminder of his past mistakes, but it also served as a symbol of his commitment to change. His story became a testament to the power of self-reflection, the importance of accountability, and the possibility of redemption. A year had passed since the eviction. The empty storefront that once housed Fitzwilliam's barbershop had been repainted, its faded sign replaced with a fresh, vibrant mural depicting diverse faces from the community. The space now housed a community center, a hub for social gatherings, educational programs, and workshops focused on diversity and inclusion. It was a symbol of the transformation that had taken place, a testament to the power of collective action and the possibility of positive change. Mr. Johnson, having witnessed the community's healing and Fitzwilliam's genuine efforts at redemption, felt a sense of satisfaction and closure. He hadn't sought revenge. He'd sought justice, and in the process, he'd inadvertently sparked a broader conversation about racial prejudice and the importance of accountability. The community center was a tangible manifestation of that change, a symbol of hope and progress. Fitzwilliam, having completed his journey of self-reflection and personal growth, found himself in a new role, a far cry from the barber he once was. He'd become a respected member of the community, a vocal advocate for social justice, and a mentor to young people. He used his story to educate others, sharing his experiences as a cautionary tale and a testament to the power of change. He regularly visited the community center, offering his support and expertise. He volunteered his time, sharing his skills and knowledge with the community he had once harmed. He found a deep sense of purpose in his new role, a sense of fulfillment that surpassed anything he'd experienced in his former life. He'd established a strong relationship with Mr. Johnson, their initial conflict having transformed into a bond built on mutual respect and understanding. They often met at the community center, discussing ways to further promote social justice and racial equality. Their story became a powerful example of how conflict can lead to reconciliation, how prejudice can be overcome, and how individuals can transform their lives and make a positive impact on their communities. The community center thrived, becoming a vibrant hub of activity, a place where people from all backgrounds could come together, learn from each other, and build a stronger, more inclusive community. It was a testament to the resilience of the community, its capacity for healing, and its commitment to creating a more just and equitable society. Fitzwilliam's story served as a powerful reminder that change is possible, that prejudice can be overcome, and that redemption is attainable. His journey wasn't easy, but it was a testament to the power of self-reflection, the importance of accountability, and the transformative potential of forgiveness. The community center stood as a symbol of that transformation, a beacon of hope for a brighter future, a future built on understanding, empathy, and a commitment to creating a more just and equitable world for all. The incident had left an indelible mark on the community, but it was a mark that ultimately served as a catalyst for positive change, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of hope.